Hello, everybody. My name is Jeffrey Michael Gomez. I'm an undergrad history major student at Kane. I'm joined by Marc-Andrew and Ruqayyah. You guys want to say something about yourselves?
Hi, my name is Marc-Andrew Duvelson. I am a history slash education major at King University. It's my first semester here, and I'm excited to do the podcast today.
Good to hear. Good to hear. And you, Ruqayyah?
I'm Ruqayyah Abdur-Rahman. I am a history major with a minor in social media, and I'm also really excited to do this podcast.
Awesome, awesome. So this semester we've had the pleasure of exploring many aspects of historiography, and specifically applying this field to study the life and world around William Livingston. He was an influential figure during the American Revolution, and who, as well as being this monumental character, also served as the first governor of the state of New Jersey. So, yeah, pretty important. Today, we would like to take the opportunity to discuss amongst ourselves our personal findings during the course of our research. These topics will include things such as the economics of slavery, the lives of the New Jersey slaves during the life of William Livingston, and the experience of the enslaved during the American Revolution. So we're going to start underway. I'm going to start with the topic of the economics of slavery. So the first thing that I found when I was researching this subject really ran into the fact that the Livingston family, William Livingston's father, his grandfather, they made their fortune off of trading slaves, and it wasn't in the entirety of what they traded in. They were also merchants in other capacities. They would trade things from the Caribbean, import them to the United States, but they also did run trading expeditions into Africa. And with this, I found that it was kind of weird because if you look at the Livingston family, they actually are from New York originally, and he is a uh, William Livingston's grandfather. He was a lord, so he was in the noble class at this point. So it was just weird to me that he would have to resort to something like this to make a living. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I personally feel like it is weird, but it also makes me think of the ideal. Enough money is never enough. You always want to keep up with your high class status, and the main way is by money, you know?
Yeah, that's true. Um, yeah, and like they had their money in things such as tobacco as well, and that's what they were trading in the West Indies at the time. But Philip Livingston, which was William Livingston's father, actually owned a ship that would run trade missions all the way to Madagascar to get slaves. Which, wow, that's far for. Remember, this is in the time of colonial times when trade missions like
Yes.
that could have taken like a year. Um, so it shows that they did do this sort of thing, which my misconception was always that the North really didn't deal in slaves all that much. So just to find this kind of proof really sets
Hmm.
the stage for William Livingston and slavery around this time in the North, and specifically New Jersey and New York. Um, William
And I
Livingston.
like
Oh,
your
yeah.
point of view about that because even I'm sorry,
No, no, you can go.
even
Sorry.
with you saying that, it also makes you realize that the money was coming in a slower process than nowadays. The way we just kind of get it transferred into our bank. We don't even have to meet a person face to face to get cash.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Actually, oh, were you gonna say something, Marc-Andrew?
Oh no, you can keep going.
Okay. It's interesting that you bring something up like that because I'm just trying to relate it to like current times. Imagine trying to live in this pandemic without that electronic currency that we have, right? Like we have that instant source to try to pay for things that we get. So imagine trying to live
Yeah.
a time like that, you know? when they didn't have this kind of thing. Imagine just trying to even relate this time to that time. But I'll keep on going. And one thing is that William Livingston, though his family did deal in slavery, he really didn't. He did have 2 slaves of his own within his lifetime that he personally owned, and we have evidence of this in receipts that he's done when he's trying to repair shoes of slaves that he has. One specifically we actually talked about in one of our discussion posts earlier this semester, and it shows that he did somewhat care for his slaves. So it's not like he was a backbreaking master. I mean, he did own slaves, but you know, it's a different situation. And I mean, he was thoughtful enough to not want his slaves to go barefoot. So now, to say whether that's for an economic purpose, because obviously that would be a less efficient slave if they were barefoot and they started to develop problems with their feet, that I can't tell you. But it does show that there was a level of care for some of these slaves. He would become an abolitionist later on in his life, and we can see this in countless letters that he's writing to numerous people. And if I can bring this up, I will talk about one specifically. So yeah, William Livingston and Samuel Allinson have a discussion where William Livingston is talking to him and trying to convince him of the cause of abolitionism and manumission. And he also does this in another letter directly to the New York Manumission Society. So he's trying to show himself that he is part of this. He's part of this movement to free his slaves and the slaves of others, and he's trying to show that he's had a moral turning. And we have a bill of his own manumission for his slaves, where he actually frees his own slaves that he owns. And it shows that though it was part of his past, he was willing to see the error in his ways in regards to this. So if we look back on other things that were just happening around this time, he was also writing about a lot of different things regarding the revolution itself. He was known to be against war, but also a man who saw the need for the United States to become somewhat independent. So it shows, again, that he is thinking about things in a way that is not just, oh, I'm with this side, I'm a patriot on this side, and I'm going to follow whatever this side says that we need to do. So, yeah, like, it's one of those things that you sort of, like, forget to mention. Like, you know, you can be divided on a subject, right? It's not just something that is black and white. And we see that later on, when he actually becomes governor of New Jersey, is that he starts to deal with a lot of different things in regards to slavery. One of the key facts that I found about New Jersey itself and it owning slaves in regards to the economics is that it was one of the last northern states to actually abolish slavery, and that was done in 1804. And it wasn't done for the reasons that you would normally see when you would free a slave, saying, you're like, oh no, it's morally unjust. It was kind of done for an economic purpose. And you actually see some of the preconceptions of this within the American Revolution, and that is that a lot of people are arguing against abolishing slavery in New Jersey is because they made the argument that if the people or if the men were fighting the war, then who would be doing all the planting, who would be doing all the farming? And that is where slavery was actually most prevalent, was on these farms. We can't exactly call them plantations, but they were farms, and they were growing crops.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
it shows that it was not all too far that different, from the South. So what do you like? What do you guys think about that?
Well, what I've learned from my own research is that, and I'll talk about this more when I do my little spiel, but I will say is that New Jersey, of all the northern states, was the worst in regards to race relations.
Yeah.
Other than it's like New York and like New Jersey, but a lot of people say New Jersey was like way worse than New York in terms of race relations and slavery as well. So, and I'll talk more into detail about that, but I'm not surprised that that's sort of how they they did things. But I'm surprised it wasn't called plantations; they were just called farms.
Yeah, they were really just called farms. Like plantations, I guess picked up that connotation in the South because they were forming more cash crops, and those
Mm.
cash
Yeah.
crops sort of, I guess, regarded as like, oh, this is not necessarily a farm because you're not producing, like edible goods. So, but in most of the sources that I find, they actually call them farms. And that actually brings me to something else, is where something else interesting that I found, which was Queens College, today known as Rutgers University, was actually founded like right within the slaving belt of New Jersey, which was like Central Jersey. And for all of those who say that Central Jersey doesn't exist, you're wrong.
Because it doesn't.
It exists.
Right? It doesn't.
I am living testament to the fact that it exists. I live on the northern side of the Raritan River, and that Raritan River sits where? In central New Jersey. Okay,
You're on the north side, so therefore
north side
you're
of
north.
this
You're
of the. It exists. Okay, it exists.
I can't.
But
It's okay. We'll allow you to think that.
all right,
okay. Let's move on.
I'll settle for that. But one of those interesting things that I did find is that many of the people who were maybe I shouldn't call them slavers or owners of slaves in this area, they actually came from places like Barbados and the other British island colonies within the Caribbean. So they brought their tradition of slavery over to the United States, specifically New Jersey, in this area. And in this time, you see that there are a certain number of freed slaves, and they're not exactly seeing the good treatment that would probably be expected of northern states, because they live amongst people who necessarily don't agree that they should be free slaves, or free people. So it shows that even after the abolition in New Jersey, minds were divided on how these things should be seen. And I think it really just speaks to the economics of the situation, because the reason they were keeping these slaves is because New Jersey, I don't know if you've ever heard, like another name for it is the Garden State, and that's because we were a farming state. We would produce a lot of produce, and so they needed that cheap labor or virtually free labor after the price was paid to sort of run their farms. And so you can see that it hurt them. It would hurt them financially. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to see if you guys have any questions about these things.
No question. Well, actually, I do have a question. So, do you know at what point was it that when So what's actually what a better question? What kind of crops did they grow that they used slave labor for? I don't know if you explained that. I didn't.
Yeah, no, that I couldn't find specifically, though
Okay.
from like my knowledge, they were growing a lot of like your common crops, things such as wheat, barley, um,
Mhm.
those kind of common things. But if you remember, like in this time when you had a farm, it wasn't just like a small farm; it was a big thing that a single person would have trouble trying to harvest themselves, plant themselves, do all the work that a farm requires. And so
Mm.
instead of hiring a person who was free and you had to pay a decent amount, you could buy a slave and it would pay off in time and you would get that virtually free labor. So, yeah, I can't say specifically what kind of crops they were, though that is a good question. I would like to actually look that up. So, yeah, I'll look into it.
All right. That's all I have.
All right. So, if I can, I'll pass it off to one of you guys and we can start on another subject.
I'll go.
Okay.
All right. So in my research, I really wanted to discover what it was the life of a slave. So I wrote a little spiel and intro. So while I was discussing, when we were discussing about New Jersey's relationship with slavery, New Jersey was the worst in terms of in terms of racial relations in the North. Even up until the 1930s, people called New Jersey the southern part of the North because how badly they treated Black people just in general through discrimination, segregation, up until more recently. A lot of people have discovered why this was the way it was, and a lot of people have made some observations, maybe because the Black population in New Jersey was really high, and what a lot of people presume is that a lot of the higher the population of Blacks rise so quickly, the more fear a lot of the white residents in the neighborhood get. Now they don't say it's a complete answer to why it is, but they say that might be one of the answers to why racial relations in New Jersey was so bad. But New Jersey had slaves, and the way they treated the slaves was just absolutely horrible. One of the worst slave codes in all of the North. For example, you can get 40 lashes, and you'd have to be branded, which basically they take an iron rod and they brand it, and they brand T on your cheek for thief. And if you were a Black man and you wanted to have a sexual relationship with a white woman, you would be castrated. And those things, castrated basically means they cut it off. So that's just a few of the different things in New Jersey they did to keep their slaves, in check. So I'm gonna briefly talk about the revolution. I know Ruqayyah's gonna do the revolution, but I want to talk a little bit about it. So I did the message to John Jay and talking about some of the he sent a letter to William Livingston about the Dunmore Proclamation and how it was their final this Dunmore Proclamation, if you don't know, it basically a decree that any slaves that wanted to be freed, they can join the British Army, and they can be granted their freedom if they join the British Army against the Union. And when I found out by further research that a lot of Black people were in favor of the British Army, thinking that they were going to be freed if they joined the British forces. In reality, the Britons still practiced slavery for decades on end. They were really doing that not because they cared about them. It's really mostly they just wanted to destabilize the colonies so that they can take over and win the Revolutionary War. So in terms of Livingston, he had to grapple with the institution of slavery in his public life. The first popular elected governor in New Jersey as well. In his correspondence and public announcements, Governor Livingston clearly outlined the divisions over the institution of slavery, writing to a Quaker ally, Samuel Allison. Livingston showed that his personal sentiments were turning against the institution, as we see, because he became very abolitionist towards the end of his life. While many Patriots leaders did not see the irony of the revolution in the name of liberty being held by slave owners, Livingston could recognize that slavery was very bad and disgraceful among Americans who had idolized liberty. So basically, he's very much like the founding fathers in terms of how do I fight a war about slavery, not about freedom, and then have slavery. Like those two things just contradict each other completely. And as you can see by even a lot of what Thomas Jefferson wrote, a lot of George Washington wrote, they clearly realized that slavery was a bad thing. But since the South was so pro-slavery, it kind of just got washed away, and it just backed and backed, and like they meant to even researching from my U.S. History 1 class, they planned on getting rid of slavery early on, but they just pushed it back to the South so against it. And what that did was that they made tensions between the North and the South just got worse and worse and worse until we have the Civil War. Unfortunately, discovering the history of voices who were enslaved in America is a difficult task. the reason being is pretty simple. Basically, they didn't want slaves to read. Because if slaves knew how to read, they would realize that slavery is bad. So, a lot of people, if you research Frederick Douglass is a very famous abolitionist. He learned how to read in secret. And as he learned how to read, he started being enlightened, realizing that slavery is just this very awful thing. And basically, that's what they didn't want. So you can be killed, you can be thrown in, you can have your hands cut off for trying to learn how to read. So therefore, there's not really a lot of documents from actual enslaved people, other than the few that escaped, especially not from the people who were still enslaved. So what we have to go by is the recordings of other people talking about slaves. So that's what I'm going to do. Any questions for me? If you have
Well,
any.
yeah, I not necessarily questions, but I do have the comment. I know you mentioned how many African Americans were actually in favor of the British during this time, and it's one of those things that often gets left out, and it's actually very interesting. You know, they have this thing called the Book of Negroes, where many of those people who did serve in the British Army or in the British military in any capacity who came from slave stock from the United States, well, at the time, the colonies, they would have been taken to Africa, and a lot of the initial settlement in the country of Sierra Leone actually came from this these people who fled from the United States in order to get that freedom that probably wouldn't have been allowed to them because one, they served under the British and so they would have been seen somewhat as traitors, and two, because to have a normal life in the United States when they're so they're so caught up in this idea of race and what that entails, it probably wouldn't have been possible.
So you
Um,
trying to say that they went back to Africa? Is that what you just said?
Not all of them. Some of them did have,
Okay.
because one of the things that they did do is that they would send them right after the war. They sent them to Nova Scotia, and now
Hmm.
this is a small group of people. It's not huge, but people who came to New York when the British were leaving the United States after the war in the retreat, I guess, against after the war. They sent them to Nova Scotia. They set up a colony there, specifically of just Africans. And then from there, they transferred them over to Sierra Leone if they chose to do so. So it just shows that it all comes together, right? It's very connected, this situation. The other thing I think that you said was just like the general feelings and the sentiment that people had. Yeah, that was one of those things when I was reading on why some of the reasons that the slaves were abolished and what William Livingston had to say specifically. There's this one quote that he says uh, in regards to why people would say, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna hire a slave," right? And he says, and if his employer should talk of buying Negroes to cultivate his farm, with the impossibility of working it at such extravagant wages, then I would advise the laborer to preach against the sin of slave keeping. And if the farmer, coinciding with his doctrine, should say that in order to avoid that sin, he would encourage the importation of white servants from foreign parts, then let the laborer insist upon it. That measure should distress the poor of America by lowering the wages, and that whoever countenances such emigrations is an enemy of his country. And so this quote specifically shows that yes, he is against slavery, but he also doesn't want to accept the job market, right? Because he says, all right, that those jobs that were for slaves, they should be given to the poor of America so that they can better their lives. You shouldn't be doing that other form of virtual slavery, which is indentured servitude. So it shows that people are in a way against slavery, but they're not totally against slavery, even if it's sort of slavery of people of their own kind. And I don't know, I just found that interesting.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anything else from you, Kai? Before I move on.
Yeah, no, but the last point that you made, it made me think of 12 years of slave. how he had a white man who was kind of serving some time in a way because he wasn't really like a slave. So yeah, they even had the ideal of like me, I don't care if you're white, you're still gonna have to work on my plantation. So yeah, I think that's also a great point.
Mhm. All right, great. So there are a few documents that I had to sort of decipher to see the message of how the slaves were treated. So there's one by Catherine Kitty Livingston to William Livingston. So the letter Catherine writes a letter to William about her bringing her servants to the estate where she lives. She talks about two servants, Jenny and James, who are husband and wife. She actually talks very positively about them. Now, and she speaks very well about the two servants, calling Jenny an excellent cook, calling James better than the white servant she'd ever had. She even actually argues for black house servants as opposed to white servants in her letter. And it seems to me that this is an example of sort of the difference between how slavery is treated in the North and the South now, being nice treatment of slavery, like you're still a slave, like
Yeah,
you're
you're so.
still owned. So it's not particularly the best situation, but at least you were treated a lot nicer than people in the South. Um, and this is in contrast to another letter that I had to decipher from. This is John Keene to Susan Livingston Keene, and John's writing to his wife Susan while they're apart. John is in the South, I believe, Georgia, and in his letter, John had talked about how slaves are putting in the work that is obligated to remove hundreds of trees because they're making new land for plantations. I just wanted to read this quote really quickly. Houston and Mary were a few days ago. Mr. Caesar behaves intolerably. I have not been obligated to flog him above half a dozen times since I have been here. But my field slaves are very troublesome. They have been so long indulged that work goes hard with them. They have been obligated to cut down 100 acres of new land since the 1st of January to get it ready to plant by the 1st of April, which is no easy matter, especially when they have to get ready 160 acres of other land to plant also. I flatten myself with making a good prop, as I now have some of the first land for indigo in this the part of the world. If I can sell about 3,000 worths of land, I should be perfectly at ease, but I am afraid to venture into the new constitution. And like I said earlier, the show is just such a contrast between how slaves are treated in the North and the South. Because when you're in a big, well, people in the South are objectively more racist than people in the North. So they treated slavery as like literal child slavery. It's like they beat them, they whip them, torture them, rape them to get them to do what they want. And you can start to see how slavery is just this thing where like, it's hard to get your slaves to work because being enslaved is wrong. So of course they're not going to really want to work that hard. So yeah, that was sort of the contrast that I saw between the North and the Southern slaves. And just a quick note, there was another one, Sarah Livingston to Susanna French Livingston. She's talking about the birth of her daughter, and that she talks briefly about her housewife, and she gives her sort of praise too. So another sort of the North has the good slavery, basically in quotation marks. Um, and then I wanted to talk briefly about how New Jersey struggled to end slavery. So you know, they don't see the one of the things that people don't realize is even though they abolished slavery in 1804, it wasn't really an abolishment. It was sort of like they signed a bill about progression to abolishing slavery. So they canceled the slaves trade and they made a new legislation saying that anyone who was born after this certain date could be could like they weren't automatically slaves when they were born. But even so, then slavery was still around in New Jersey up until the 1860s, and and even took a while for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to be passed in New Jersey because there were still slaves, and a lot of the slave owners didn't want their slaves to be sold, or else they'd lose a lot of revenue. So, just a little fun fact that I just wanted to tell you guys about. So that's sort of my spiel.
It's it's a lot. It's crazy to think that it could exist. Well, relatively recently, right? Like when we're speaking of these
Yeah.
kind of things. Yeah, it's in one of those things that I was reading. They specifically mentioned that if a woman was enslaved, like her children would still be considered
Mhm.
slaves, and men who were sort of manumissioned or they were freed by this act in 1804, uh, until they were like 25, they still had to live on the land
Yeah,
that their master, so to say, uh, worked or owned. I mean, so it shows that really, yes, it was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't entirely like you're free now. So yeah, it's crazy to just think about that.
absolutely. All right, so I'm done. Rakai, you want to go finally last? So we wrap this thing up?
Yes. So personally, for me, when I have heard from other people, and then also my ideal until learning about the American Revolution, I think a lot of people think of Fourth of July. They think of gaining your independence from the British people, and it's like it's just more than that. And I think that's why a lot of people don't understand why a lot of Black people don't celebrate Fourth of July.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's
So
yeah. I'm sorry.
yeah, so yeah, no, it's okay. It's a little delayed on my end. So as you said before, many of Americans were siding with the British because they mainly thought, okay, this is how I could get my freedom granted. But as we see, as you said, it was kind of like a little bit, yeah, you might get free, you might not. So from my research, and also I have worked at the Liberty Hall Museum, and being there, we really didn't get to talk about the slaves during the American Revolution. And a lot of my work that I have found is about William Livingston, but there was something I was able to find that I found really interesting, and I just wanted to share. It was this free slave named Peter Kittenridge, and
Hmm.
he was able to serve in the American Revolution. So he was not from New Jersey, but I felt like his story was very important because here it is, a man that's free during the war, and he was able to live a nice life. He also did a 5-year contract, and 8 years go by. He has a family. He's free. He's no longer a slave, and he was able to support his family. So that was like just a little story I wanted to add in, just to show people that there is maybe not as many, but there was a narrative, and he wrote a whole long letter just about his life. And sometimes we think there isn't really a chance for someone to get their story out because of the consequences, but there was. And like moving on, oh, if you guys want to say anything about that.
Well, if I could chime in, yeah, no, it's yeah, like like you said, the consequences, right? Like to even think that there would be consequences about telling your life story, right? Like if he was any other man, that would be normal, right? It would just be, oh yeah, he's telling his life story because you lived through
Yeah.
a prolific event, the American Revolution, like the birth of this country, and he wanted to have his part in history. Yet, because of the color of his skin, even though he served, like you said, he may have been able to live a nice life, but nice is relative,
Yes.
right? Nice in terms of a man of color who had to live during that time and deal with those kind of things that he would have dealt with, racism, you know, maybe not getting his fair share. So yeah, it's good to hear that something like this does survive, and I'm actually like very surprised to see
Yeah.
that it
That
does.
was his experience wasn't as like good or bad, but it wasn't as bad as being a slave. So in a way he had his own privilege that many of his ancestors and people of his time was not experiencing, except if you were free and able to go to the war. Also, there were still free slaves and slaves participating in the war. Not really knowing if being in the war would grant them a chance to their freedom.
Hmm.
So another thing I wanted to talk about is, of course, William Livingston, and he recently moved to New Jersey after the American Revolution broke out. So he moved from New York, and after spending a few years as a lawyer, he wanted to do something to help slaves become free. And he did express in some of his letters how like fighting for the independence was becoming like extremely wearing and often like frustrating on him. And he wasn't really able to get it approved by like the military laws, or he was not able to get the military laws approved, and then just the ideal of abolishing slavery. So he was one of the people, one of our founding fathers, who had a hard time trying to push that forth, as you guys said it and express in New Jersey. Us thinking, oh, this is a North state. Of course, they're going to prove that. But then it's also the ideal. We're still getting a lot of money from slaves. And then also, yes, slavery is coming expensive, which kind of led to the ideal of slaves being free, during this like American Revolution era. And then also something else I found was this slave who ran away. And it wasn't so interesting that like ran away, and he was also from Monmouth County in New Jersey. It was more so the fact when I read like it was a £3 reward if they found him. It was it was, well, not even a sentence, it was just a line, the wording, not very black. So when I personally look at that, and if you guys would like afterwards, you can tell me how you felt. When I looked at that, I said, I wonder, because now this time slavery has been going on. Was he a product of a, back then the term would be, allowed, a mulatto? Was he considered to be a light skinned black? Because it's like not very black. Like, what was they characterizing that by? So, how do you guys feel about that?
Uh, Marc-Andrew, you're mute.
Sorry. He probably could have been a product of miscegenation. Probably, maybe probably someone who was half black, half white. There were a lot of those people who were mulatto at the time, so probably, I mean, he's still a black man to the eyes of society, but
Yeah, because that 1%.
the one drop rule, yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Um, yeah, no,
Yeah.
I see this and I think, we saw it when we were studying things like the 1619 project, right? Like people have voiced this opinion, like they called it, I believe, in one of the articles that she had the color of rape, right? Like her skin was the color of rape, because let's not beat around the bush. That's probably what was happening a lot of this time because they were
Oh
property.
no, I think you're referring to the it was the I think no, that wasn't 1619. It was the article about the Confederate statue, and like she was talking about, oh well, if you want a statue of the Confederacy, I am the product of white supremacy,
Yeah,
basically. Yeah.
within the overall 1619 part. Remember that it was
Oh,
a
was?
group
Oh,
of
I thought
it
it was
was
a
a
different.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was part of that whole collection. Like there was the
Okay.
one with the street plans and how cities are affected by that. But yeah, this was part of this. But it shows that this was happening, and I'm sure if it was able to happen in southern states, seeing the reactions that people have to slavery in New Jersey, I don't think it's a far fetched to say that this is probably what was happening as well. Because that's a clear distinction to make,
Yeah.
not too black. It's when you clearly see people for their color and nothing else, to make that distinction is something that it must have been important to them. So, yeah, no, it's very interesting that you pointed that out.
Yeah. Thank you. And then I also felt while reading this, I did some more research, and you could see that there were a lot of slaves running away. This was an opportunity for them to run away and escape all the way up to Canada, some Pennsylvania. And that was it was like, yeah, everyone's getting our freedom, but we're not really getting our freedom, but because of that, we're not going to really take that chance for America or the United Kingdom to decide what our path is going to be. We're going to make our own path. So you were able to see a lot were escaping. And then another thing about William Livingston, yes, he did free two slaves, but he also kept two enslaved people on the behalf of his daughter.
Hmm.
It, it's kind of like one right doesn't make, I mean, two rights doesn't make, I can't even think of the saying right now.
But no, we get the sense of it.
Yeah. But when I
Yeah.
think about things like that, like to us, it seems ridiculous how that's even a conversation. But, like, you have to understand in that time, slavery was kind of. It's like what's a good example? I was gonna say smoking, or like, smoking weed's a good example. Like, smoking weed is controversial, same way as slavery was controversial. So basically, it's kind of just like, if I'm just like, well, I don't smoke weed, but I'm going to give my friend some money to smoke some weed. It's kind of just like, but like in 100 years from now, it's going to be stupid how like we even thought that smoking weed was even controversial. Basically, that's how you got to think about things like that. Because in 100 years,
Yeah,
things that
no,
we're controversial
definitely.
about won't be controversial then. So
Yeah.
Yeah, but sometimes, uh,
No, no, you can go
um,
ahead, Ruqayyah.
so, okay, thank you. Sometimes I do feel like that does allow a people to say in the ideal of, oh, it's okay, it happened years ago. And it's even recently, you have people who were born in the 1950s. They think it's okay because it's like, oh no, my grandmother was born like decades ago. So for her, like, no, but you have to kind of teach people it's not okay, even no matter what era it was, because as you see in the
oh no,
era
that's
we
not.
have
I'm not
now,
trying to justify.
2020.
Oh no, I'm not trying to
Oh
justify
yeah, no,
it.
I
I'm
know you're
trying
not trying to justify it. Yeah, no, definitely. Because even I do take that perspective too. Like, I'm not trying to make an excuse, but we do have to look at the certain time. So no, I definitely understand where you're coming from.
definitely.
And then I feel like another great point was when you talked about John Jay, which just for everyone out there who might not know, he was married to Sarah Livingston, and she also had a slave that she was kind of close with, if you want to say. How do you guys feel about that relationship?
Well, with John Jay and Sarah Livingston, right? So, in regards to looking at it through the perspective of, okay, they own slaves, and William Livingston, a man who is supposed to be against slaves, allowing, slaves into his house because of his daughter. I mean, it's one of those things like, are you going to throw out your daughter because she owns slaves? You might be
Yeah.
morally against it, but at the same time, she's family, and he does benefit from having those slaves in his household again. So I can't say with utter certainty how it makes me feel, because it's one of those things. He's proven that he's, at least in literature, in writing, that he is against it, and he makes multiple claims against it, that, slavery is wrong. He's seen the error in his ways, but if you look at it, you're dealing with a familial issue at this point. So that's my take on it.
Mhm.
I feel the same way too. And if anything, kind of looking at it from like a, I don't know, child perspective of being like with my parents, I think you can raise your child to be a certain way, but no matter what, we're all going to make our own decisions. And you just have to love your child no matter what. So That's exactly how I feel. Just to end it here on my topic, slavery, it took years for slavery to end, and even now we're still, you know, benefiting from the effects of slavery in a bad way. So even though slavery has been over for years now, the process that it took for them and even for us now, and even if you want to look at the Jim Crow era, it's like this is the color people section, this is the white section only. It's still a process that we're still working on. And I think this was all of us talking about this was a great topic because it showed us where America came from before the American Revolution and where we are now because of America's independence and also from the British.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's one of those things. Like I said, I had that misconception all the way until I got into college that New Jersey never had slaves. So to be able to research this and be proven wrong, essentially, it's a great topic to study. And for those of you who are listening, I encourage you to look into this subject. It's something that is very valuable to understanding where we came from as a nation and how we got here. So yeah, it's something you definitely should research. So if we're done here, I just want to say thank you, everybody. Doing research isn't easy, but it was great to hear all these different perspectives, right? Like I tended to focus on the economics, but to hear like these personal experiences that I personally didn't find, it just it reaffirms to what I was studying, what I was doing while I was researching to see that yeah, no, this is a personal thing. It's not just about money, right? So yeah, I just
Yes.
wanted to say thank you guys for doing this. Thanks to Dr. Hyde for giving us the opportunity to do this, and
Yeah.
I wish everybody who's
Thank you
whatever
very much.
time you're listening, good night, good evening, good good morning, whatever. Uh, thank you.